Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Alastair.
And I'm Nick.
And in this episode, we'll be discussing not one, but two huge new films. First of all, there's DC's new superhero blockbuster, Wonder Woman, and then there's Colossal, starring Anne Hathaway. We will also be looking at the first episode of The Handmaid's Tale, based on the novel by Margaret Atwood, and finding out what Nick thought about Ridley Scott's sci-fi classic Blade Runner. But before all of that, Nick, do you have anything to recommend to our listeners?
Well, I've had laryngitis all week and my voice has barely recovered. I wouldn't recommend that. So, yes, yet again, slight disclaimer, if my voice sounds weird, it's because I've been ill. I will eventually, hopefully, stop being ill for more than one episode at a time. That aside, something technically we both did, which I was going to talk about. On Tuesday, before we recorded this, we both went to see The Bugle live, which is another podcast, not a pop culture podcast, but I feel still very good. To be fair, it's a very well-known podcast, so it's possible recommending The Bugle to podcast listeners is a bit recommending water to people. But yeah, this is, for anyone who doesn't know, the long-running satire podcast hosted by Andy Zaltzman and formerly co-hosted regularly by John Oliver and now by a rotating cast, including Nish Kumar, Helen Zaltzman, Wyatt Cenac and a couple of others. And yeah, when we saw it, it was Andy Zaltzman and Nish Kumar, and yeah, especially for long-term Bugle fans, it was pretty good fun. They did a pun run, which is exactly what it sounds like, to be honest. It's a run of increasingly torturous puns. They bullshitted Food and News, and it being 2017 and there being a British general election. I think the day this episode comes out, actually. I think this is technically our Election Day special.
Yeah, this is a bit of election coverage.
Yeah, this is it. We're going to cover the election by talking about someone else covering the election. And aside from that, we're not going to mention it because, to be honest, I imagine you may listen to this for a break from that. Yeah, no, it was a lot of fun. They bullshitted impressively through all of the recent election gibberish that's been going on, and for long-term Bugle in-joke fans, yes, large chunks of the audience did get to shout "fuck you, Chris" at the producer, which he seemed to enjoy a lot. Yeah,
it was a very funny night. Yeah, I sort of laughed continuously. It was one of those shows that's so funny you go away with your chest hurting a bit from laughing so much.
Yeah, I think if you want to experience what we experienced, I believe one of the most recent Bugle episodes to go up, I mean, as of this recording, the most recent, is something like Election Special Live in London, which is a recording of the show we were at. So if you want to literally hear what we heard, you can do that.
And hear our voices in a kind of chorus of laughter. We're in there somewhere.
And yes, if you've been listening to our voices carefully enough over the last 38 episodes, maybe you can pick them out of the cacophony of laughter at the Bugle Live special, yeah. But I'm a big fan of Nish Kumar as a Bugle co-host. I think, for me, he's the one who really recaptures the Zaltzman-Oliver chemistry magic. Plus, I think his general sort of comic style is slightly Oliver-esque, so yeah.
Yeah, he's very self-deprecating, which is part of John Oliver's sort of sense of humour. He also does have great chemistry with Andy Zaltzman. They work really well together.
Yeah, it just helps, yeah. The Bugle obviously used to be recorded transatlantically, and then John Oliver got a bit more successful and had a bit less time, and I think... And yeah, I must admit, it does feel a lot more resurgence and an active concern now that he's moved on to the rotating cast of hosts, and he can actually do it every week. And he can actually do things like live shows now, which obviously he couldn't before. So it does make it feel a bit more like a living, going thing.
Yeah, exactly. Now that they're not doing it transatlantically, it can be live. Plus, also, it does keep it fresher having different co-hosts. There's an Australian comedian who's been co-host a few times, Alice Fraser. She's very, very funny. So yeah, they're getting some good people in. And it does make it each episode sort of fresh and a bit different to have sort of rotating co-hosts.
Yeah, and I think all in all, it's just nice that the Bugle is a big, vibrant thing again. Because it felt like kind of a shame that podcasts as a whole were going hugely mainstream. But the podcasts, one of the couple of podcasts that originally got me into podcasts had sort of trailed off. So yeah, it's nice to see it actually starting to ride the podcast wave a bit.
Yeah, it was one of the first podcasts that I got into as well, and I really like it. I'm glad it's continuing, because it was a bit sad when it looked at one point it might sort of fade away.
Although I was proud, one of the last things they did on the original Oliver Zaltzman Bugle before it went on this sort of indefinite hiatus was answering a question from me about whether the World Cup looks like a hand cupping a testicle. One of my proudest moments in my podcasting career, to be honest, is still accidentally killing the old form of the Bugle with a question about balls.
It's probably your joke that's gone out to the biggest audience.
Oh god, that's actually true, isn't it? And on that horrendous bombshell, Alastair, what have you done in the last fortnight?
I went to Field Day, Victoria Park's premier music festival. Victoria Park being a large park in East London, not to be confused with the large park in East Glasgow or the large park in Leicester. Anyway, they have an annual one-day music festival there, which was yesterday. And yeah, it was a really, really good day, beautiful sunshine, and saw some really great artists. The headline was Aphex Twin, who doesn't play many shows. It was amazing. It was almost impossible to describe. It was just this kind of wall of noise coming at you with kind of like all sorts of crazy flickering projections and laser beams. And I know, yeah, it really was, I know, somewhere between like a DJ set, a rock concert, and some sort of bizarre work of confrontational abstract art. There were lots of people trying to videotape bits of it on their phones in the audience, and I was just like, no video will ever be able to capture what this is like. There was a quite impressive moment when, it built this kind of enormous sort of screeching sound at the end and then died suddenly. They didn't just stopped. And it was when the whole spectacle went away, it was almost like intensely painful just to be left in kind of silence and darkness for a moment. So that was a pretty intense experience. There was also, a few other good artists we saw. There was aggressive electronic artist called Death Grips, did a pretty good out-of-control show with some pretty heavy moshing, and got sucked into a whirlpool for the first time in my life. So that's a first and intense experience.
For those of us who don't enjoy going to gigs and getting voluntarily beaten up, what's a whirlpool?
Oh, a whirlpool is, okay, so in a mosh pit, there'll be a bit when kind of everyone pulls back to make space. There'll be a bit, some people may try to do a bit of dancing in the middle of this space, which is usually ill-advised. So then what happens is everyone rushes in and kind of compacts together, and usually sort of going around in a circle with the people in the middle being compressed the most. You see it it happens a lot at punk gigs and sort of quite heavy industrial music gigs. So everyone just kind of pulls out and then surges together. So it's just kind of running headfirst into other people. When I was at the edge of one, I was on the very edge and I saw it pulling back. Everyone pulling back, and I suddenly realised what was about to happen, and there was this moment of terror. And then I realised, obviously, there's nothing you can do about it, because everyone surged forwards. You have to surge forwards yourself, or you'll just be trampled.
You were on the outside rather than in the middle.
I was on the outside when it opened, and then obviously as it surged in, I was in the middle.
Yeah.
That was like, it was kind of like a roller coaster. Terrifying at first, then quite exhilarating. So that was good fun. Yeah, we saw it's a bit more chilled artists, like Forest Swords. They're very good. Nina Kravitz, I think that's how it's pronounced. Definitely highly recommended. Great festival.
I decided not to go because I hadn't heard of any of the artists. And then I caught laryngitis, so probably for the best, really.
Probably for the best. Yeah, I'm interested to see what artists they get next year. This year was a bit more electronic-y. Last year they had more rock artists.
See, I'd have probably gone to that. The year they had Andrew WK, I definitely probably have gone to that.
Yeah, that was a good gig. That was a very good gig. Andrew WK was incredibly intense, which I didn't really expect, because I thought that, it's Andrew WK, it's just like a funny thing on the internet. So I went quite close to the front. When he got going, it was incredibly intense, and there were people crowd surfing. Then there was a stage invasion. The wall behind where he was playing kind of collapsed, and there was just kind of people wandering around aimlessly on the stage.
Yeah, you always think the whole party hard thing is some sort of broad ironic joke, and then until you're actually in the middle of it, I suppose.
The best thing about Andrew WK is, so it was kind of him playing the keyboard live, because he's a classically trained pianist. So it was him just playing the keyboard live, with obviously like backing tracks for the other, for the bass, drums, and the rest of it. But he also did have just a guy who just stood there and just yelled "party" into a microphone as well while he sung. So it was an Andrew WK gig is everything you expect it to be.
Now I just feel even sadder about having missed it. Okay, and first up in today's lineup, it's Wonder Woman, the first DC superhero film of the year, the fourth movie, I think, in their current attempt at a cinematic universe after Man of Steel, Batman v Superman, and Suicide Squad. This stars Gal Gadot as the titular Wonder Woman, although she's not called Wonder Woman in this film, she's just Princess Diana of Themyscira. And this film tells the story of her... It literally tells the story of her entire life up to a point, to be honest. It starts with her as a child on Themyscira, and goes from there to her leaving Themyscira to discover man's world and getting involved in World War I. And there's also a present-day framing sequence, but it's pretty nothingy. This was widely seen as the first chance for an actual good film in this cinematic universe, because the first three were various combinations of a bit dull and a bit flat-out shit. And it's now come out. It's probably no massive spoiler to say the reviews have been pretty good. But Alastair, what did you think? Yeah, on the whole, very positive. Gets a thumbs up. There's some great action sequences in it. Yeah, really sort of spectacular, entertaining fight sequences. Really impressive bits. Even like from pretty much the opening of the film, when you see the Amazons training on their island, and there's sort of people leaning off horses, sort of upside down to shoot arrows at targets, or like leaping through the air in slow motion bullet time effects. So yeah, even from the get-go, there's some great action scenes. Early on, there's a really good action sequence in which loads of German soldiers attempt to invade the Amazons island. Yeah, and again, there's like
spectacular fighting there. So yeah, the action was very good. Also, yeah, it's got a sense of humour, some quite good comic bits, especially when Deanna leaves the island and comes to our world. And obviously there's some good fish out of water comedy stuff when she just doesn't really understand fashion or the fact that you can't walk around in London with a sword and a shield. Yeah, there's some good jokes, which I think, crucially, that was something that's been lacking from previous DC films.
There's definitely a sense of humour, and enough humour for it to feel a bit more sort of relatably human. But I don't think they've really gone all the way to like a Joss Whedon-esque quip fest. You know, it's not constantly snarky. They've sort of correctly matched the tone to the character in a similar way to the way they did in the Captain America films. Most of the jokes are quite sort of warm and gentle.
Yeah.
There's not much of people sort of snipping at each other.
It's not like, like I say, it's not like as full of jokes as Joss Whedon film versions of like The Avengers or what have you. As we talked before, there does seem to be like a good sweet spot for action movies that have basically kind of like a bit of sense of humour, good action, which I think DC haven't been good at getting that kind of mix right. Maybe it's because of the sort of success of the Christopher Nolan Batman films that leaned heavily on the kind of seriousness, and Christopher Nolan was good at making those films, but DC haven't been able to replicate that formula since. But I felt that like for a mainstream action blockbuster, a bit of sense of humour is kind of essential, and I'm glad that this film did have one.
I mean, this is probably the best DC comic-based film since Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight, I think. I mean, that's not that high a bar, apart from maybe Dark Knight Returns. Basically everything since then has been kind of garbage. But everyone said that, so you don't want to damn the film with faint praise. This is, I think, a genuinely good, quite compelling, quite affecting film that both functions as a good superhero film of, our current generation, and feels like it does enough new and interesting to escape the slight sense of sameness that the genre has maybe been creeping into lately. Like, it's been a bit better this year, but last year with Doctor Strange and Civil War, there was a certain sense of, have we seen this before? It feels a bit like we've seen this before. I don't know, this felt like it was doing something different. It had a sense of sort of scale and beauty and the aesthetic, and the character came through well enough in the tone of the film that it actually felt like it was its own unique thing, which I liked quite a lot. I mean, yes, this film did have good jokes and good fights in it, but I was, invested in it and affected by it, which is something that doesn't always happen with these sort of 12A action films, and it is nice when they get it right, and it's something that, obviously people didn't necessarily expect from DC because of everything we've already said about the last few films. Yeah,
you're right about being very invested in the character of Wonder Woman. She is like the core of this film. She's in almost every scene. And yeah, you really do get sort of invested with her and carried on her journey. Maybe that's because Gal Gadot is very good in the role. Yeah, she's really kind of made the character her own, invests it with real personality, shows some vulnerability as well as obviously being a competent, superpowered super person. Yeah, there's a really good character at the core of this film, which is all built around, which is another essential ingredient that they got right this time.
Well, yeah, I think Gal Gadot as Wonder Woman, I mean, especially if she can pull this off in another couple of films, has the potential to be another, genuinely iconic bit of casting, like Chris Evans as Captain America or Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man. She, for better or worse, and no matter what this does to the rest of her career, she is this character. I don't know, as long as being in this Zack Snyder Justice League film doesn't mess that up too much. But yeah, I think she's a massive presence in this film, and she pulls off one of these characters who can just be, my main thing is that I'm nice and quite strong, and what that translates to on screen is boring, which is something people often say about characters like Captain America and Superman, which they've tried to deal with in the current Superman franchise by making him sort of sneery and sulky, which hasn't really worked anyway. But yeah, I think what Gal Gadot's done here is just possibly just on raw charisma. It's possible that it's ultimately just a question of they found someone who has the right level of sheer legal, compassionate charisma to just sell this particular part. But whatever, it's a brilliant performance, and Chris Pine's really good as well. I've never had a huge problem with him as Captain Kirk, but I've heard him take a bit of shit in reviews. But he is really good in this. He does really sell his character without stealing the screen from Wonder Woman.
Yeah, I agree with you that this could be a great iconic piece of superhero casting, like the ones you mentioned. Yeah, she is really, really good in the role. She, gives the character, a bit of personality, which is good because, as you say, characters like Superman or Captain America could be seen as a bit boring. I think the difference between, say, Superman in the sort of previous couple of Superman films and Wonder Woman here is that Gal Gadot is a better actress than Henry Cavill. He can do the kind of regal Superman bits, but he's not really good at giving the character much vulnerability, which was definitely present here, mainly through her relationship with the Chris Pine character. Yeah, he's very good in this film. Without wanting to spoil this for people who haven't seen it yet, there's a very good emotional scene of Chris Pine's character towards the end of the film, and it was a really kind of quite surprisingly touching moment that had, kind of intense bit of emotion that, you don't always get with, like you say, 12/8 action movies. There were bits in Logan that were certainly like that, but I don't really recall there being a moment like that in Doctor Strange that really I felt quite as sort of affecting. And that's, because of, the two principals in this film are very good together and they've got chemistry and their relationship is built up well. That's one of the great things about this film.
Well, yeah, and the last few conversations in the film between Wonder Woman and Steve Trevor, the Chris Pine character, they're incredibly intense conversations, and they are very much about the things that have been building throughout the film, like, as well as their relationship. The film does actually talk a bit about, the whole people are complex creatures with the capacity for good and evil message, as opposed to Wonder Woman's slightly simplistic view on war as some sort of curse by an evil god, because she's been raised on Themyscira, where intentionally or unintentionally that idea has been put in her head. And they sort of go back and forth on this, and it ends up sort of exploding in these 2 or 3 quite intense arguments. And they're really sad conversations between Pine and Gatto, and they really, really do bring a tear to the eye, because it's really a massive emotional high point for the film. Unfortunately, after that, there's a massive fight, which I'm going to complain about a bit in a minute. But before that, those few conversations are amazing.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to say, if we're going to sort of talk about some other things before we get to talking about the ending, is I thought the period setting was really good. That's another way to, as you said, this film seems a bit fresher, maybe more original than some of the, sort of superhero 12/8 action films. I think partly, period setting is really good. They did a really good job of bringing early 20th century London to life. The set design, costume design is really beautiful, really well done. There's some great, like comedic moments, like when they arrive in London by boat and the Chris Pine character says, "Welcome to London." And then Deanna's like, "It's hideous." And then he's like, "It's not for everyone." But as a Londoner, I can relate to that.
Yeah, exactly. That's the sort of, understated. I mean, the joke is, I guess, that Wonder Woman is very sincere. No one there's being snarky.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's all these nice scenes where she just, with complete goodwill, just says what she feels. And like when she has ice cream for the first time and rejoices at the niceness of it, it's just a nice, funny, sweet bit.
Yeah.
And it's one of these things that makes the character incredibly likeable, and it's one of the reasons why this film is largely pretty great. And the fact that it is trying to say something about war. I mean, it's a fairly simple message about, people can be evil, because, it's a fucking action superhero movie. It's not War and Peace. At least it's actually saying something and doing it warmly and with at least a degree of nuance. Yeah.
Both the warm sense of humour and the sort of horrors of war bits, which there is good emotional moments in this film when Wonder Woman is confronted by the horrors of mechanized warfare, like chemical attacks and trench warfare and how awful it is. And I think it works quite well because Wonder Woman is a really good sort of fish out of water character, which leads to some, really warm, funny bits, like the bits when she's shopping or the bits when she's buying the ice cream, as you said. But also because the fish out of water stuff, because it's great for the comedy bits, but it's also good for the more serious war is horrible parts, because she's not from this world and doesn't understand it and has to confront head on the raw horribleness of the First World War. There's like some bits when she's like walking through the trenches and seeing the injured and the dispossessed, and she's saying like, we need to help these people, and then Chris Pine is very much like, it's a war. Lots of people are suffering. We can't help everyone. And because she's, this fish out of water character, the film is able to confront the horrors of war stuff directly and sort of in an accessible way. And those were some of the best bits of the film.
Yes, and again, because they've developed the Chris Pine character quite well, he doesn't come across as a dick for saying those things.
Yeah, exactly.
And I guess there could be a moment of pause for, is this a film about Wonder Woman solving World War One? And if so, is that a bit weird? But that feeling never seems to quite get there for me.
No, and also, it does take quite a few liberties with history, but to be honest, I didn't find it that distracting and didn't really take me out of the fantasy very much. The characters, the humour and the action kind of carried the film through.
And it does look lovely. I mean, some Marvel films do have this slightly television-esque low-budget thing going on, but Wonder Woman has this real sense of the lush, sweeping epic.
Yeah, exactly. It's beautifully realised.
Yeah, I mean, some of the DC films, like Batman v Superman, sorry, again, they've clearly thrown absolute 17 dump trucks of money at it, and you just wish they'd stop. But no, they've done it right here. This film does look really lovely.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we're going to complain about the ending. Specifically the large fight at the end. I'm still going to endeavour not to describe what happens, but if you're massively sensitive about spoilers, then you might want to leg it, I don't know.
Yeah, skip to the next segment.
Yeah, okay. At the end of this film, there is a gigantic... Well, it's not as gigantic as some, but it's a good 15-20 minutes in which Wonder Woman and the villain, who is just a big final boss thing, basically. He delivers a big villain speech, and then they punch each other for a while. And although, to be fair to it, I've referred to it in a slightly despairing tone as the ending like I'm going to complain about, but I've seen worse in superhero films. I've seen much worse in superhero films. But Yeah, possibly just because I've been enjoying most of the film up to that point so much, where it does somewhat stop for a long period of punching on a fairly boring flat grey plane. Yeah, it just really annoyed me. It just...
It is a problem with effects-driven superhero films. They can just descend into objects flying into each other at the end, and it all feels a bit weightless and inconsequential. This film isn't as bad as that. Yeah, there is a sort of feeling of threat and consequence, but it is on the edge of mindless spectacle rather than being actual mindless spectacle. It doesn't have some of the problems, like, for example, I think the first Avengers movie and Dark Knight Rises, as we talked about before, have these problems when they go out at the end. Whereas, like, I think it's better if a film ends by focusing the action in on antagonist relationship and having the conflict come down to two characters at the end.
Fundamentally, yes, but the trouble is when it then goes on for ages and it's just these two characters fighting in the same plane, if anything, that makes it even duller.
Yeah, that is the problem, that it's just these two characters. My other criticism of the ending is that, on the whole, I just wasn't convinced by the villain for this film. He had, a few pretentious human nature things. His vague plan of prolonging the war through engineering an armistice didn't seem to make much sense. Yeah, I just wasn't convinced by this villain at all.
I think it's just the boring villain problem that's in a lot of these films. This film ultimately exists to sell you on Wonder Woman. And it 100% succeeds, yeah. Don't get me wrong. I'm now officially here for all future films featuring the Gal Gadot Wonder Woman. Yes, even Justice League. But... yes, the villains are boring. The villains are just here so that the hero can beat them and look good. But this film does do a better job than many of giving some emotional weight to that, although it mostly pivots on Diana's relationship with Steve Trevor rather than anything the villain's doing.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And yeah, the villain does seem a bit sort of bolted on. In fact, I would have preferred it, and we're possibly getting into spoilerish territory here, but there's a kind of running theme throughout the film. We talked about whether this villain is even real or not. I'd have preferred it if in the end, the villain wasn't real or turned out to exist only in a symbolic sense. When they kind of pulled a superpowered, god villain out of the bag at the end of the film so they could have a big special effects filled finale, I was a bit I'm a bit disappointed in that. You could have done something more creative and more original. For example, even though I've so far during this review compared Wonder Woman favourably to Doctor Strange, and I would say overall it is a better film than Doctor Strange, but Doctor Strange did at least come up with an original take on the final villain confrontation. The bit where Wonder Woman falls down is not having an original take.
Well, yeah, I think we've said before, both last year's Marvel films did at least try and do something other than the throw a thing at the screen approach to the ending, whereas this year we seem to have regressed a bit in that regard. Both this film and Guardians went slightly too far the wrong way. But yeah, I think there's a need to satisfy the genre, and then there's the fact that this film was actually doing some interesting, intelligent things about, the nature of war. They probably needed to find a bit more of a compromise, which they haven't quite managed. In that there would have been a way of just, maybe not implying that the villain caused the war, but implying that he was just, he's just standing in the sidelines masturbating or something. Probably not literally, because it's a 12A film, but you know what I mean. And you're right, there were better ways to do this, and it's just a shame because the film had come into this with a lot of genuine nuance and emotional intelligence, and it did seem like it broke down to a load of fighting, or at least Diana broke down to doing a load of fighting, whilst a lot of the interesting plot resolution stuff fell to Steve Trevor, which was kind of a shame in the final conclusion there.
Yeah.
I mean, it is what it is. It just felt a bit, I just felt slightly let down compared to the much better, more nuanced stuff earlier on.
Yeah, that is a shame. And also there wasn't much of a relationship between Wonder Woman and the villain when he appeared at the end, because he felt a bit tacked on to the end of the film. Even though he mentioned a lot, he hadn't appeared beforehand, which meant they didn't have much of a relationship. So that, again, they didn't feel like an enormous amount of weight or consequence to this fight. They did a very good job of spending the time they had to develop the characters' relationships, they put into developing, the relationship between the Wonder Woman and the Chris Pine character, which really paid off. They had a great relationship. Like you said, there's some good bits when, they can have some good debates about, the themes of the film, and it seems appropriate because Wonder Woman's such a fish out of water character. She needs these things explained to her. And also she brings a whole new perspective on humanity, which allows us to talk about these issues openly. And I'm glad they spent the time developing those relationships. But it did come with the cost of not really developing much of a relationship between Wonder Woman and the principal villain, which did mean that there wasn't much emotion going on in the final confrontation. There was only violence and special effects.
And, as I say, I hope we talked long enough about what we liked about this film to impress upon the listeners that this really isn't, a deal breaker here. This is a very good superhero film. It's a good 2.5 hours long, and this fight is only about 15-20 minutes of it. But It's just it's just the sad reality of these things, that the higher you get my expectations beforehand, the more disappointed I might be if your fight at the end ultimately is just a bit, yeah.
And what is quite a good film up to that point maybe lets itself down at the end, but it is a very good film up until that point, and it was very entertaining. And it is ridiculous that it's taken this long for any of the main sort of superhero movie houses to come up with a superhero film with a female lead character. It is ridiculous it's taking this long, because this is a good film, so I don't know why they didn't make it earlier.
Yeah, I know, well, I genuinely expected Marvel to just crap out a Black Widow film just to say they did it first, but they somehow didn't.
Next, we will be discussing Colossal, a new film starring Anne Hathaway and Jason Sudeikis. Anne Hathaway plays Gloria, who breaks up with her boyfriend in New York because she drinks too much and parties too hard. Gloria moves back to the small town where she grew up and quickly falls back in with old friends like Oscar, played by Jason Sudeikis, and life returns to normal. However, after a night of heavy drinking, Gloria wakes up to find out that a giant monster has attacked Seoul in Korea. At first, Gloria is terrified, but soon she discovers that this monster's behaviour is similar to her own actions last night. This is an odd film that mixes small-town drama with sci-fi and fantasy. We saw it recently. Nick, what did you think?
Yes, this was really good. There have actually been a lot of films like this in the sort of 2000s, or so that's when I noticed them. Sort of a fairly well-known actor making a sort of credible Hollywood indie film about emotions and finding yourself, often involving like moving to or visiting your hometown. It seemed to become a bit of a cliche in the 2000s.
Like Garden State.
That was literally my next few words, yes. Zach Braff's Garden State, Nicolas Cage is the weatherman. Not all bad, obviously. I mean, Jim Carrey's Eternal Sunshine for Spotless Mind was in many ways one of those films, even without the hometown aspect, and that's really good. So, yeah, it's not that it doesn't mean they're bad, but it seemed to become a bit of a thing. But yeah, it sort of leads into that cliche a bit of the sort of quirky actor showcase indie comedy with a twist, because Anne Hathaway moves back to her parents' house, meets an unfetteringly handsome guy from back home, and, realistically, you go into movies having seen trailers, or at least read a few paragraphs on the internet, so I knew the giant monsters were coming, but it still managed to surprise me a little. It went to some dark places. I guess I shouldn't be too surprised that there's some darkness in a film where the central metaphor is kind of literally people are monsters, but yeah, there's some bleak thoughts about alcoholism in there and some material about abuse that's genuinely quite sort of unsettling. Not in a tossed off way, like not in a, we've explained this character's actions by saying they were beaten up as a kid. No, this is some visceral material.
It is much darker than I expected it to be. The premise and some of the trailer does make it look like more of a comedy, whereas it starts out, there are definitely some funny bits, but it does, as it develops, go to some quite dark places. What makes this film so good for me is Anne Hathaway's performance as Gloria. She's very, very good as the main character of this film, that the whole film is sort of built around her. Yeah, she comes across as likeable, quite sort of honest, believable character. She makes mistakes, she messes up, but in a relatable way. You don't get the feeling that her life is spinning completely out of control. She just has poor judgment and, likes to drink maybe a bit too much. And this leads to some bad decisions on her part. Yeah, they go into like her past and her relationship with the other characters in sort of detail. So the other characters in this film are also quite complex. They're kind of Jason Sudeikis' character. They're introduced and you get kind of one sense of them, and then as you get to know them more, other aspects come out. Slowly over time, he develops these quite complex characters. So one of the good things that independent films do well is spending the time on really detailed characterization. And these people do feel like really realistic, detailed characters.
Yeah, I mean, Anne Hathaway, her transition from sort of wholesome kids actress to serious, credible adult one finished ages ago. She's been in quite a lot of good films. And she's here again being good. Playing an alcoholic with a sort of a nice, this is both Anne Hathaway and the writing, I guess, playing an alcoholic with a certain amount of, realistic restraint. There's no hilarious cartoon slurring or comical antics. There's just this gentle sort of slight tug of it sort of fucking up her life by keeping her out all night and making her sleep all day and erasing large chunks from her memory and leaving her to just not really think about how their actions harm other people, which obviously goes back to the metaphor of the giant monster crushing people underfoot without really noticing.
Yeah.
And it's all quite nicely done and understated. There's a joke bit in The Simpsons where Marge Simpson pours a glass in the middle of the day, a glass of wine, obviously, in the middle of the day, and then a ridiculous music cue comes on, like, duh, duh, duh. It's like, my God, she's now an alcoholic and everything's fucked. Obviously, that's a joke about how TV and films portray alcoholism compared to how it actually is. And Colossal does quite a good job of portraying how it actually is. It doesn't really go straight into she's obviously fucking up her life. There's just quite a lot of her obviously staying out too late, drinking with these guys she's just met in this bar. And she doesn't do any obviously self-destructive things. She just stays there all night drinking and talking and then walks home. But the rot just sort of sets in.
Yeah. it's difficult to say what the character's relationship with alcohol is. Like, she is able to stop drinking at various points. And it just seems to be more that she sort of doesn't have a lot of restraint or self-control, or she kind of does what she wants to do, you kind of in the moment. Or other characters feel that she needs to kind of grow up a bit and take life more seriously. But what's interesting about the character is that one of her sort of emotional journey over time is not her deciding that she needs to take life more seriously necessarily, or her deciding that she needs to stop drinking, although she does try to do both of those things. It's more that she actually decides she needs to stop being told what to do by other people. Like, the film opens with, her boyfriend basically giving this kind of critique of her life and what she should do and what's wrong with her in a quite mean-spirited way, even though he dresses it up in a kind of, I'm only looking out for your best interests, which isn't necessarily true. He's more just telling her what he wants from her as a partner and kind of in some way trying to be controlling. The key to the character is not overcoming addiction or, maturing into an adult. The key to the character is realizing that she needs to live her own life and make her own decisions and not be told what to do by men.
Yeah, I mean, the plot thread of her alcoholism, if anything, is wrapped up in quite a funny way towards the end. It is quite a tossed off way, to be honest, which might annoy you if you're a storytelling hardliner, but I quite like it. Yeah, but Jason Sudeikis is really good. He's playing a bit of a difficult role here. This character transitions slowly from, this seems like a nice, wholesome, fresh-faced hometown man to something a bit darker, and I think he pitches it quite nicely as, well, he and the writing pitch it quite nicely, and you quite quickly get the feeling something is amiss, and it just sort of builds and builds and builds. Obviously, again, probably not coincidentally, much like the way it portrays her alcoholism, it just sort of, by the time you realise, no, this is clearly disastrous, it's sort of too late.
It's got a good use of a fantasy analogy, the monsters appearing and attacking Korea. And it's not actually, which I thought it would be as straightforward as when she gets drunk, she becomes a monster. That's not the metaphor they're going for here, which is what I thought they may be going for from the trailer. They do a good, metaphor of, as you said, use the fantasy stuff to underline the central theme that, people are monsters, and the other central theme that you're not always aware of the impact your actions have on other people, and you need to take responsibility for that, and you need to run your own life by taking responsibility. That's the difference between being a child and being an adult, is that adults take responsibility. Yeah, I thought that was handled really well through a quite sort of, straightforward science fiction plot line. It was just, very, very deftly done. It's what I, really like to see in a piece. A well-deployed fantasy or sci-fi metaphor.
You may be able to tell from the fact that we've been talking about this for a decent chunk of time now and not really mentions the monsters that much. The giant monsters and giant robots and kaiju or whatever aren't really that huge a part of the film in a lot of ways. It's basically a sort of small-town character piece about the two main characters and their sort of the people in their orbit. Because the monsters aren't on screen that much, they've clearly got enough budget to make them look pretty cool when they do appear. And they're very sort of archetypal, which when they're playing this sort of symbolic role is, I guess, what you want. There's a big sort of, as you'd expect it, lizardy thing, and a big sort of, as you'd expect, giant robot.
Yeah.
And they fight, and it's good. But obviously, because the storytelling's done a quite a good job, in many, what you really care about is how it affects the Anne Hathaway and Jason Sudeikis characters, which is in many ways in you buying into the delusion of the film, because you should probably care a bit about the people in Seoul there's just basically stamping on.
Anne Hathaway has the understandable emotional reaction when she finds out that this is going on. She kind of sinks into depression a bit and decides, I don't think she thinks about running away, but decides that she should confront what she's done and try to make some kind of amends. Again, because this film spends a lot of time in character, it does really develop those sort of the emotional response to the characters, and it all seems very, very believable. The fantasy monsters bits, they're important, but they're kind of important in a way of them, just sort of kind of developing the themes and the relationships that the film was built around. They're just another way to explore that, similar to how the Spider-Man films work, that having the kind of the superpowered conflicts between characters that have personal relationships and interpersonal relationships is just a way to develop and tell the story of these characters, and it works the same in this film.
Yeah, I mean, back to Wonder Woman, I guess, in that even though there is just these two monsters fighting on the other side of the world, they're very sparingly deployed. At no point does it feel like the director, Nacho Vigalondo, has just decided, fuck it, I'm going to have a 10-minute sequence of the two kaiju fighting now, because I want to. It's very, very sort of sparse.
Yeah.
Because unlike the director of Wonder Woman and or the executive board of DC Comics, who knows who plans this stuff, there's an awareness that you need to show what you need to show and not 20 pointless minutes of it.
That's one of the things that makes the film quite deft. Yeah, it focuses on developing the characters when it needs to, primarily, and the other stuff kind of fits in to support that. The things involving the kaiju do relate to the interpersonal, the relationship conflict of the film, which is, they use the fantasy sci-fi elements to show how people can be abusive and controlling to other people. I think they approach the kind of abusive relationships in a quite nuanced and sophisticated way. For example, they show that people who come across as nice and friendly and charismatic, like the Oscar character played by Jason Sudeikis, how people who, seem quite nice can actually be really controlling and abusive. They also show you that you don't have to be physically abusive to be emotionally abusive and manipulating of someone. There's a bit when, the Gloria character is sort of hitting and fighting Oscar, and he's not fighting back or really trying to hurt her that much, but he's still abusing and manipulating and controlling her by using the power that he has over her, the power of the innocent people in Korea that he can hurt. It shows how, nice people can be controlling, like when the old boyfriend comes back into her life. She could then use as an excuse to renounce responsibility by doing exactly what he says, and show that even though he's nicer than Jason Sudeikis, he's not as manipulative or abusive, but he's still quite controlling and quite possessive, and doesn't really want to let her lead her own life, which she needs to take responsibility for. So it does develop these themes of control and abuse in a very subtle way. It doesn't just fall back on developing storylines around physical abuse. It does show the manifold ways in which relationships can be abusive, some of which don't get explored as much in pop culture, so people aren't quite as aware or familiar with, how people can be controlling and emotionally manipulative can sometimes be as bad as people who are physically abusive. And the film does develop, through the detailed characterization, the way it's paced out, it does redevelop that.
Yeah, with the ex-boyfriend character, played by Dan Stevens from Legion, playing an evil British man, because all British men are evil. Mm-hmm. Well, he wasn't. Yeah, that was facetious. In a similar vein to the Jason Sudeikis character, I guess. It's almost as if, again, it's some sort of theme. He sort of appears early on, and he's being a bit of a dick, but in the first scene, because you don't fully know what's going on yet, you can and because, you've seen these films before, ultimately this is probably going to be some sort of story about the lead character being a mess and having to get her life together. You're open to the idea he might have a point, and then by the time he's come back again, you're getting into the idea that he's probably just, as you say, being controlling in his own way. Yeah, it opens up as it goes along in a clever way, which is, yes, a good thing this film does.
And it's well paced as well. I kind of thought it's got quite a relatively long, sort of emotionally and thematically complex story to tell, and with some detailed characters to develop. And it does handle it all well, and everything comes out. And you get just enough explanation to make it believable, and you're always there with the characters. Very good film. I really enjoyed it.
We are covering it a bit after the UK release, but if it's in a cinema near you, I think it'll probably have a good second life on DVD or streaming this one. It's definitely worth checking out if you can find it.
Yeah, certainly. And also, it is a good film that will work, unlike maybe like Wonder Woman, that some of the impact of it might be lost on the small screen because of how impressively it is realised. This film will come across very well, I think, on a streaming or DVD. So if you're looking for a good night in with a film, definitely go for this one.
Good depressing film about emotional abuse. Oh yeah, get it. And third up today, we're going to talk about The Handmaid's Tale, the new TV series from Hulu, adapting the classic novel by Margaret Atwood, which has just started on Channel 4 in the UK. We have seen the first episode. This features Elizabeth Moss as Offred, a young woman who lives in a sort of near-future dystopia where everyone appears to be infertile and the few women who are fertile are forced into a terrifying sex slave arrangements in order to continue the species. Brief content warning, I guess. We are probably going to have to talk about, at least briefly at some stage, about the slightly grim sexual assault scene in this episode, the first episode, the one we've seen. So if you don't want to hear us talk about that, probably not in extreme graphic detail, I stress, but we will probably mention it, then feel free to use the timestamps in the description to skip to the next segment. Thank you. Alastair, what did you think of this?
It's very powerful. It's very good. It's enjoyable because it's quite intense and it's very depressing. We've seen the first episode, and my main takeaway, I'd say, is it is a quite faithful adaptation of the book. And the book is very powerful and, very, very well written. For only twice in my life has someone stopped me on the underground to tell me the book I was reading was amazing, and one of them was when I was reading The Handmaid's Tale. So it's a book with a dedicated following, and people really like it because it is very good and very well written. And this is a very faithful adaptation. Not only is the first episode is very similar to pretty much chapter 1 of the book, which covers their kind of Offred's shopping trip and takes you through her daily routine, which introduces the main other characters and the themes. So not only does this kind of quite closely follow the events of the book, they've added in extra bits, obviously because they're trying to pace a relatively short book out into a longer TV adaptation. But not only have they adapted literally what happens quite closely, they've also taken over the kind of the bleakness and the sort of chilling horror of it. Yeah, it's a very faithful adaptation. It's a very good adaptation. It's quite intense and unpleasant. But yeah, if you like the book, this is a good adaptation. It is quite dark and bleak if you haven't read the book, but it is certainly a powerful piece of TV.
I haven't read the book. I might do at some point. I think my girlfriend has a copy. If I'm going to spread it out over several years, I may end up reading it before I wait to see how the entire TV show plays out. But yeah, this first episode did sort of hammer home the depressing nature of the world, which is definitely the key point here, I guess. The sort of the atmosphere, the gloomy cultishness, the oft-seen in sort of fiction idea. Probably because it's quite accurate that, people can go ahead and do some horrific shit if, it's seen as the thing to do. If society is going along with it, they'll sort of trudge through it, even if they are correctly horrified by what they're doing. And obviously, as we lurch towards a broader global catastrophe, hello again, general election, it's hard not to find that shit mildly unsettling. I gather they put the first 3 episodes up in one go on Hulu, so maybe if you binge the first 3 episodes, you might come away with a greater sense of the actual plot, which I didn't really, apart from a couple of lines at the very end. But in terms of world building, this was very good.
Yeah, it does introduce pretty much all the main themes and the main aspects, and sums up the world, you get a sense of, the world this story is going to take place in. There's quite a few complex things they have to develop, which is done through a series of flashbacks. One of the main things, the way the TV show works, as well as telling the story in the present, there's plenty of flashbacks showing how they got into this situation. And it does develop this quite complex world, because there's quite a lot of aspects to it. There's the fact that most people are infertile. There's the fact that America has now become a theocratic dictatorship, the sort of dystopian aspects. There's also the fact how women's roles are so prescribed and controlled. Like, not only the handmaidens, there's the Marthas who are like domestic help, and there's very strict roles for like the wives. Everyone's got a very specific role. Their society is incredibly controlling towards women. And the worst aspect of it is the few women who are capable of bearing children, how they basically become property of the few men that the system is sort of set up to benefit, the commanders, who are the rich and powerful men. Yeah, there's all these different kind of aspects of it, kind of the history of this world and how it operates that are quite neatly introduced and developed in the first episode.
Yeah, it is quite unsettling, if only because this book was published in 1985. We know this because we've just Googled it and then cut out the part where we Googled it. And maybe it felt more near to the surface then, the idea of it becoming a religious theocracy. Like, I, in my childlike naivety, think that at this point, 30 years later, religion is less central in public life, and if something horrific did happen, I can easily imagine us sliding into something that uncomfortably resembles fascism. I'm not sure I can imagine it being a theocracy. But on the other hand, I do get the feeling this is set in the present day, or at least the flashbacks to normal life are set in the present day. This is imagine a catastrophe happened in the 2010s, not imagine a catastrophe happened in the 80s.
Yeah, the theocratic regime in the book, which is developed in the TV show, I think is a really interesting metaphor for patriarchy in general. The way most things use sci-fi metaphors, they just take something that exists in reality and makes it more prevalent. The way that patriarchy subscribes specific roles for women. Women are punished for stepping outside those roles. The system is based quite heavily on control. They just make it more brutal and obvious in this kind of dictatorship. And also the fact that the system exists to benefit only really a few men. Most of the men in the patriarchal system of The Handmaid's Tale are also oppressed by the dictatorship. They get more power and more autonomy than most of the women, which is one of the reasons why they go along with it. But it's still not really great for them. The only people who really benefit are the commanders, the few men with the power over all the women, which is not too different to how patriarchy in our world works, in that, gender roles are bad for men, they're worse for women, and obviously non-binary people and trans people as well. But it's really only a few patriarchal men that really benefit from the system, but the fact that most people, especially most men, are more invested in it and having superior status to women is what perpetuates the system. And they've taken those social dynamics and then sort of turn them into a more military structured, directly dystopian or authoritarian state to make the power relationships between men and women more obvious and to make these kind of points about gender and patriarchy more accessible. But they are doing it to explore a system that's present in our world.
Yeah, I think that's what makes it still work as a sort of a plausible, or at least sort of scarily possible seeming dystopia, in that you might be able to say, oh, that wouldn't happen nowadays because religion's less prominent than it used to be. But yeah, the ideas of the patriarchy and so on are still real and plausible in our society, so maybe something like that could happen through that.
I think the book doesn't go into a huge amount of detail about, what the actual sect that's taken over America is like. I think it's heavily based on Puritanism, and it's sort of maybe similar to like some of the religious beliefs of people like Oliver Cromwell, very, very Puritan, sort of Protestant belief. The main feature of it is this reading of a bit from the Bible, the Handmaid's story in the Bible, where is it the character Rachel gives a child to another character. I can't remember much of the story, but they lean heavily on that to support their ideology of controlling women and using them for birth. And then also that's developed through flashbacks to these kind of indoctrination centers when they program the handmaidens to accept these new, very controlling lives that this regime has created for them. There's some quite brutal bits when some people try to resist and point out the darkness, and they get kind of clamped down on very hard and then become a kind of depressed husk and ultimately accept the status quo of this dictatorship because it's less painful.
Yeah, I thought the sort of the violent justice moment at the end where they beat the shit out of that rapist was weird, if only because of the slightly strange hypocrisy at the heart of the whole thing, and also I don't know, it stops it being an incredibly binary sort of belief system that you could describe in 6 words, but it doesn't make it any less sort of manky and unpleasant.
Yeah.
Because obviously there've been the aforewarned about, incredibly unpleasant, depressing sort of rape scene with the ceremony, the routine thing that happens when you're a handmaid, when you're forced or at least expected to have sex with the husband or the master of the house. Obviously an incredibly grim scene. And then shortly after that they beat the shit out of someone for raping a handmaid, and this curiosity doesn't make you any more sympathetic, it just makes it all the more slightly odd, and like you've got this weird sense of ownership over it all.
It's, I think, goes to show how their totalitarian system works, in that they've come up with a way for the handmaidens to let out their anger and frustration with how miserably they're treated by occasionally letting them savagely kill this person who you're told that he raped a handmaiden, but you don't know if he's a political prisoner. I suppose it's not really gone into. Well, he's not in the first episode. It might be in the future episodes. What it is similar to is in 1984 when they have the 10-minute hate, which is the idea that basically the system has created a pressure release valve, so people can let out their frustration, anger, and hatred in order to keep it functioning. Sometimes in fiction you see dystopian societies, and you kind of think this would just collapse so quickly because there's no... how would such a system... I'm thinking is it Divergent? The YA books, when their kind of bizarre totalitarian system makes absolutely no sense, you don't see why it would emerge and why it wouldn't just collapse quite quickly, as, a lot of dictatorships do, or they kind of morph into other dictatorships. The Handmaid's Tale dictatorship seems plausible and also stable because it's playing off the patriarchal systems that exist in our world, but also it has these ways of trying to make it bearable for the handmaidens, even though it is obviously awfully oppressive. The TV adaptation also, I think, is very good at, it really gets the bits in the book that are really visceral, unpleasant, and quite disturbing are adapted very well in the TV show. So, as we've said, the scene when Offred is forced to be raped by the commander as part of the sort of surrogate mother role that she's supposed to perform. And also, the scene you mentioned when the handmaidens are allowed to murder this person or sort of kick him to death. That's really unpleasant and visceral in the book, and it comes across very unpleasant and visceral in this adaptation. Also, the indoctrination centres, when they're mainlined ideology to force them to be submissive, that's quite disturbing in the book, and that was very disturbing in this episode.
Although the scene where they get together to kick that bloke to death did at least give them a chance to actually have vaguely human, natural conversations, which I just started to think I'd really like in the episode. But yeah, the idea of them actually getting together and talking normally for just a few minutes was quite cathartic at that point as well. Not as cathartic as kicking that bloke to death, probably, but still. Not because it'd been badly written until then, just because everyone talks in this sort of quite safe, paranoid, approved language, for obviously they kind of have to because of how submissive and miserable everything is.
One of the central sort of plots of the book is Offred's friendship with the other handmaiden that she goes shopping with, and at the end of the first episode they get to the point where they realise they can talk a bit more openly, that they're both kind of sympathetic to each other. So in future episodes I can imagine there'll be more naturalistic conversations as their relationships develops and they go down that plot line in the book. More of that to come in the future. The first episode is very much establishing the way things are, and the future episodes will go more into the story and character development and things.
Well, yeah, I think obviously this is the episode. Main job was to portray just how awful it is, which they did pretty well. I came out, as you say, feeling not so much, wow, that was a rollicking episode of television, more sort of, that was intriguing and depressing. And good, obviously, Elizabeth Moss is very good in this, as she is in most things she's in. everyone else was fine. Samira Wiley from Orange is the New Black appeared in a small role, which hopefully she'll come back as.
Yes, I thought she was very good as Offred's friend from before in the sort of flashback scenes.
Yeah, I mean, the only real dull critical point I did note, but every so often I felt like the voiceover narration sometimes fell in the is this actually needed trap that voiceover narration sometimes does, where, she's just saying something we can clearly see on the screen with our eyes, or which was made fairly clear in the preceding conversation, and so we didn't really need to see Offred Wonder saying exactly what she'd obviously just said or thought. But one of these things with voiceovers, there were quite a lot of quite nice, fun, wry bits of voiceover as well, so I'm willing to accept those for the occasional, yes, we get it moment.
Yeah, but overall, very powerful start to a TV show, and I'm interested to see what happens in future episodes.
Yeah, I mean, Americans obviously I think are up to about episode 6 or 7 at this point, but yes, we'll be there for episode 2 on Channel 4 next week.
Finally, this episode, we will be discussing Ridley Scott's 1982 sci-fi noir Blade Runner. In the near future, artificial humans, known as replicants, have been created to work in dangerous environments. Since the replicant rebellion, they've been banned from Earth, and special police units known as Blade Runners are tasked with hunting them down. Harrison Ford plays Decker, a Blade Runner who is charged with hunting down 4 escaped replicants in the bleak, near-future Los Angeles. I thought now would be a good opportunity to revisit Blade Runner, now that a sequel is coming out 35 years after the original. To clear up any confusion, there are quite a few different versions of Blade Runner. We watched the final cut version of this film. Right, so Nick, now that you've had a chance to see it, what did you think?
It was good, although possibly on the I appreciated this more than I enjoyed it end of the spectrum. Not in a depressing way like Handmaid's Tale, but I just had to very much concentrate on the story rather than being gleefully swept up in it. There was at least one occasion where I started the film, then had to give up and try again later because I just wasn't in the mood. But yeah, it's a cool film with a distinct look. It has its interesting questions about whether robots are real people. I don't know whether it's one of these films that's been slightly robbed of its impact by its influence. Like, I managed not to be spoiled for the plot. I knew the sort of iconic tears in vain line was coming. But a lot of the themes about AI as people and even some of the sort of 80s cyberpunk look seemed very sort of overly familiar. Although obviously creation develops sentience and rebels against creator is a theme going back to Frankenstein, so maybe I'm over-crediting Blade Runner a bit there.
The aesthetic is certainly very influential and it's been copied a lot because it was such a big, huge hit at the time. This film is just the atmosphere is just great. It's what I really like about the whole film. It's like how the bleak Los Angeles of the future, a future that's only 2 years away.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, 2019. A lot of the incept dates for those replicants have already gone past.
Yeah, a lot of them are incepted in 2016 and 2017. Slight piece of trivia: Roy, the leader of the replicants, his inception date is David Bowie's birthday. In fact, his inception date is David Bowie's last birthday because he died 2 days later.
Coincidence? Or is it?
Da, da, da. Yes. But yeah, it's a very influential in its aesthetic. The 80s synth sax soundtrack, is quite iconic. So is the very 80s fashion sense and the kind of...
Oh, the 80s of it was the best part. All the sort of neon flashing lights, body paint, that woman doing cartwheels for some reason.
Yeah.
All these sort of ridiculously overt gestures and sort of flashiness and people drawing lines across their face for some reason. That was the most fun part.
It was very, very 80s. But it's got a very, very iconic, distinctive look. And a lot of the sort of cyberpunk, near-future urban dystopias, a lot of their aesthetic owes a lot to Blade Runner. It's very influential.
Pretty much into it by the last hour. I think it was mostly the start where I found it quite hard going in the very sort of beginning, sort of getting into it stage. I think the scene I enjoyed the most was the one where the replicants, Roy, is it? The one with the bleached hair, confronts his creator, which is odd considering it doesn't feature the protagonist.
No, that is one of the brilliant bits.
Yeah, that was a really good sort of stark, tense scene. I mean, I think I always found the world slightly more interesting than Deckard. I'm told there's a lot of tension about whether he's a robot. I sort of don't really care.
Yeah, there's a big debate around this. So Ridley Scott has said that he is. Harrison Ford has said that he isn't. I think the fact that the replicants only have like a 5-year or 4-year lifespan and they've done a sequel with old Harrison Ford is basically taken a crap on that debate because he clearly isn't. Watching the film, I've seen this quite a few times. There's loads of little things they do put in. Like, for example, there's a bit when there's this character Rachel who is a replicant but doesn't know it but is starting to suspect. To prove that she is a replicant, Decker tells her intimate memories from her childhood that no other person could possibly know because obviously they're fake memories. And then watching it back, does Decker know these memories so well because they're also his memories because he's had the same fake memories implanted in him because he's a replicant. I thought that's quite a nice little feature. There's also a bizarre bit when Decker dreams about a unicorn. And someone told me, and it's quite an interesting fan theory, that replicants dream that they see unicorns. It's to remind them that they're not real. Because obviously the unicorn dream is supposed to be a memory, but obviously people don't have memories of unicorns because they don't exist. So there's like an artificial memory implanted in the machines to remind them that they're not real because they have fake memories, like seeing unicorns and stuff, which is an interesting theory. I like it. Well, the theme of the film is what is it to be human? And the replicants have memories. They're not real, but they still have memories and pasts. Does that make them not person? And also because they're non-people, can therefore they just be hunted down and killed in the street?
Well, obviously, because the scenes where Decker shoots and kills the replicants, particularly I think the first one he shoots, the woman he tracks down to the strip club, it's not meant to be a pleasant scene, is it? You know, you're not meant to think, yay, he got her. It's meant to be quite sort of, he's just gunned that woman down in the streets, and to be honest, it feels a bit,
Yeah, Decker's not supposed to be a likeable, he's quite sort of grizzled and hard-boiled, sort of depressed character. And I don't think he's supposed to be particularly likeable or, nice. Either he's killing creatures that are at least sentient to some degree at best, or, at worst, he's kind of killing his own kind on behalf of the humans who will probably have him killed at some point.
Yeah, I mean, the scene where he forces the woman Rachel to kiss him was also pretty weird. I mean, I guess that's meant to be where we confront our feelings about what it means for them to be fake people and whether that makes it any less weird to force them to kiss you, but yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess maybe that's where I buy into the idea that they are real people to some extent, because, I mostly came away thinking, he's seeming like a bit of a dick here.
Yeah.
But I guess, therefore, the replicant is distinct from a rubber sex doll, maybe.
Yeah, well, it has some form of sentience. I really like also, the aesthetic, I say, their vision of what 2019 will look like with a giant pyramid in the middle of Los Angeles.
It's accurate, I think you'll agree.
Yeah, exactly. But there's loads of other things, like the prevalence of ads everywhere, these sort of unusual buildings. I like there's also their vision of this kind of monoculture of humanity, like the strange language that the other characters that aren't Decker speak, like the Edward James Olmos character and sort of the various shopkeepers and sort of, members of the public that he meets. They speak this strange language that's a mixture of English, Spanish and Chinese, I think. A Mandarin. I should have actually looked up what specifically it is. But it's this idea, that in the future, humanity's become much more of a monoculture and all our cultures are mixed together. That's why, like, Decker is a kind of, he spends a lot of time eating Chinese foods and stuff. And there's this kind of Latino police enforcer who's kind of put on his case to keep him on the task, played by Edward James Olmos. And the idea that these people, exist in the same kind of common human culture. That to some degree, Decker just seems a bit outside because he's a bit of a loner and he only really speaks English, which is, again, possibly indicating that he's an outsider because he's not human and he can't be a part of human culture.
Well, yeah, I mean, normally with these sort of hard-boiled detective characters, they'd, flash back to their past or something, but Decker's just kind of there, having the occasional dream. But the monoculture things, again, I mean, that's always become default sci-fi, hasn't it? A lot of that stuff is quite...
Yeah.
I sort of half expect my grim futures to be plastered with adverts and with the sense that the whole world is like that. It's just one endless city where everyone speaks the same language and buys the same food.
Yeah, exactly. It's a common theme in science fiction. I don't know if Blade Runner created it originally, but they certainly popularized it by being such an iconic hit. And also, I like the fact that the monoculture is showing human cultures mixing together rather than just kind of like, this vision of what it means to be, Western, usually probably American, has just driven out all other cultures, which is not really what's happened throughout history generally, that generally there's a mixing and a kind of standardizing. So yeah, it's a detailed vision. I mean, a lot of it, I think, I haven't read the book that it's based on, the Philip K. Dick novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? But I think some of this stuff does come from the book, and a lot of the aesthetic and the visuals are pure Ridley Scott.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of video games, actually. I feel like a lot of video games, when they're doing their dark futures and stuff, do look a lot like this.
Yeah, like endless rain and the grim bleakness, everything's very dark. There's very little light, partly because the sky is so polluted, it's kind of hard to tell the difference between night and day.
Yeah, there's definitely no tangible daytime in this film.
Yeah, so it's an interesting one to cover. Obviously, there's a lot of interest in Blade Runner right now because there's the sequel, was it Blade Runner 2049?
2049, yeah. I went to watch the trailer for that as a further research exercise, and it looks a lot more like what I'd expect a sort of mainstream sci-fi film to look like. There's some sort of slow, poetic bits, and I think possibly a lot of that's just because it's been standardised down into trailer form. I imagine the actual film might be a lot more sort of slow and thoughtful like Blade Runner was. But yeah, it's mostly Ryan Gosling and Harrison Ford doing a bit of young guy, gruff guy, back and forth. Yeah.
They said they got a very distinctive visual look for the trailer for the new film, which is continuing, even though it's not the same distinctive visual look that the original had. The fact that it was like it's going to be striking, very visually striking, is an important part of the Blade Runner sort of aesthetic and appeal. So I'm glad they're continuing that. What the film's actually like, we'll have to wait and see when it comes out.
You seem pessimistic in.
I am pessimistic about it.
Okay.
Because I don't think this film really needs a sequel, and I kind of like the ambiguous ending that this film has. So it's annoying. Why can't we just make a new sci-fi film set in 2049 starring Harrison Ford and Ryan Gosling in a dystopian future with AIs? Like I say, there's aspects of Blade Runner that aren't particularly original. It's still a great film. You can make a perfectly good other film. There's plenty of great novels out there to adapt, or just write one from scratch. I don't see why Blade Runner needs a sequel.
If they want to do another film set in the same world, then I suppose why not? Get the money. But I don't really. It does seem a bit pointless to bring Harrison Ford back. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, if they, just leave him be. Just do a separate story. It just seems a bit of a sort of pointless bolted-on appendix.
Yeah.
He says, having not seen it.
Well, obviously, check back for our podcast for a review of Blade Runner 2049 when it comes out. But anyway, so any overall thoughts now that you've seen the classic? Do you like it overall? Was it worth seeing?
It was definitely worth seeing as a sort of original sci-fi text, a sort of, what seems like quite a big foundational point for a lot of the science fiction I've seen in my life. And it was a very sort of interesting, sort of serious, thoughtful film. It definitely had its distinct look. As I say, I probably appreciated it more than I liked it. I found it quite slow going at the start to get into, but there were some very good intense scenes, and all the look was quite cool. And it's probably not going to become one of my favourite things, and I may never watch it again, but it's certainly a thing to have seen.
Cool. Well, that seems at least moderately successful. And at least now you're prepared for Blade Runner 2049.
Well, between this first film and you repeatedly saying it's going to be terrible, yep, I'm prepared.
So, in the next episode, what are you going to recommend me?
Okay, well, it's comic time again, and this time we're going to go for another one of my big young favourites. We've done Ultimate Spider-Man. This is Quantum and Woody, which is by a writer I've assigned to you before. This is Christopher Priest, who did the Black Panther comics we read very close to the beginning of this podcast.
That was good.
And artist Mark Bright. And this is very 90s. This is a 90s superhero buddy comic, basically, about two childhood friends called Eric and Woody, who are estranged for a while and then meet back up and get superpowers, and then because the nature of their powers forces them to stick together, form this sort of dysfunctional duo who try and fight crime whilst arguing about the fact that they have to stay together even though they fell out years ago. It's all very... it's a very fun comic. It did give birth to a lot of my enjoyment of wisecracking duos, out-of-sequence storytelling, and comics which take a slightly askew look at the whole superhero genre. So I'm curious how this has aged, actually, because I haven't read this for a few years. I remember liking it a lot, but I do also remember it being very, very 90s. Late 90s, but still. So yes, that's probably the first 8 issues of Quantum and Woody. 2 books, but they're both quite thin. So yes, we will attempt to read those. And again, this is the original Quantum and Woody. There was a relaunch a couple of years ago, but that's not the one we're reading.
Great. Well, tune in next time to find out what I thought. That's all we have time for this week. Thanks for listening. If you want more moderate fantasy violence, you can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes or in your podcatcher of choice. While you're there, please leave us a review so that other people can find out about the show. You can also find more episodes on our website, moderatefantasyviolence.com, where we have back issues of the podcast, bonus audio content, and the occasional written piece by Nick or myself.
And you can also follow us on social media. We are at MFV Podcast on Twitter, or you can just search Moderate Fantasy Violence on Facebook, and we're there. And yep, that's it, I think. I've been Nick Bryan. Thank you for listening. You can follow me on Twitter as @NickMB, or you can find my blog at nickbryan.com.
I've been Alastair Ball. You can follow me on Twitter at AlastairJRBall, or find more of my writing at redtrainblog.com. On the next episode, we'll be discussing the 5th series of Orange is the New Black, the 5th series of Orphan Black, and we'll be finding out what I thought of Nick's recommendation, Quantum and Woody. Have a good time until then. See you later.
Bye.
And save her from the mistakes she's made by moving back to the small town and getting mixed up with the Jason Sudeikis character. But it's just another... Impressive.
Make it.
Yeah, that was Colossal.